That's why we're having this conversation.
Yes.
That's what we're trying to figure out. If fundamentally, I believe that's the purpose of real discussion. And I think one of the reasons that YouTube conversations like this have become so powerful is because you can actually have those discussions. You know, so what we're doing is so different than network TV. It's so different. It's so revolutionary. Like I was talking to a Wall Street Journal reporter the other day, and I said, well, why do you like YouTube? And he said, well, the conversations just follow this unpredictable thread forward, and it's so interesting to watch them. I said, well, that's the logos in action. That's what you're seeing. There's nothing more compelling than that. So if we're doing this right, look, the last conversations we've had, including the very last one, have been received very positively. And I believe the reason for that is, I think that to the best of our mutual abilities, we're trying to get smarter than we were before the conversation because of the conversation.
Yes.
And people respond extremely positively to that. And isn't that wonderful that that's the case? And so we are trying to figure this out. And I would also say, don't assume malevolence where ignorance is sufficient. You know, when you look at how a large system operates, you don't want to forget that part of the reason it's not doing so well is because people actually don't know how to do it better. It's not the only reason. Malevolence exists, for sure. But, you know, and then what do? Well, you try to dispel the ignorance, your own ignorance. What you and I are trying to do right now, hopefully, is to dispel our own ignorance and to share that process with the people who are watching and listening.
I believe that the reason that you had such a profound impact in your sort of roaring campaign through identity politics, through maleness, is because, to me at least, it seemed as an observer, it's underwritten by years of clinical practice, a deep understanding of Jung, and you were genuinely orating on conquering unconscious territories, of awakening out of the unconsciousness. And like when you say that now, you know, don't assume malevolence when ignorance will suffice. You know, they know not what they do. Most people are unconscious. Our systems are unconscious. But for me, there is a reason that mainstream media prohibits and precludes certain types of discourse, favours other types of discourse, and this for me is because there is.
Well, let's take it apart for a minute. Let's take it apart, because we'll start with the ignorance before malevolence issue, and so we'll look for non-moral reasons first, and then go to moral reasons. And I think that's a safe approach, because you don't cast stones any more than necessary that way. Well, there are massive technological differences between YouTube and network TV, despite the fact that they're both video. The first is there's no bandwidth restriction. Bandwidth is now free. You and I can talk for as long as we want, and essentially no one has to pay for it except with their attention. And then it's permanent, whereas with network TV, it was evanescent. It evaporated as soon as it was spoken. Well, now this conversation will be around for probably longer than either of us would want it to be. It's as permanent as a book. And that what that means too is that I don't have to assume that my audience has a limited attention span or no memory anymore, because they can go, I know that they can go out and find out things on their own. And so when I go to do a network TV interview now, it feels like I've transported myself back in time to 1950. And the person I'm talking to, when I'm sitting in the green room before the interview, they're a person and we have a conversation. But as soon as the cameras go on, they're no longer a person. They're a puppet of a machine. And I'm not saying that critically. I'm saying because the bandwidth was so incredibly expensive, there wasn't time for experimentation. It was too expensive. And so everything the interviewer did was scripted. Well, then it was scripted according to essentially the dictates and interests of the corporation, obviously. And so then what you end up on with network TV is a discussion with a talking head representing that monolithic organization. You're not talking to another person. And if you were, that person would get fired, right? Because they would now be an individual instead of this immense machine that was necessary because the communication technology was so expensive. So you start with that, and then you might say, well, and furthermore, it was warped by the fact that the corporations of a certain size are protecting their existence, which of course they are, and so are the people within the corporation. Of course they are. Just like we would fight for our hierarchical position. Of course. So
Yes.
but all that's gone now, and now we have this, and now we're figuring out what to do with it.
Now, what you said there about the sort of the position of the journalist in the chair and how they become an automaton because their role is so prescriptive within that corporation, that's no different to something that, you know, Chomsky would have said 30, 40 years ago. You wouldn't be in that chair if you didn't share the beliefs of the corporation. This is, for me,
Of course.
Yes, of course. This chimed with something Yanis Varoufakis, the former Chancellor of Greece under Syriza, in that brief moment after the economic crash when there was a surge of leftist populism in Greece, said. He said that when he met with the EU, he realised, even when talking to the most powerful minister over economics with whom they were arguing about their sanctions, he recognised that Chancellor, he was someone like a German Chancellor or whatever, said that he only had the power, and this is in some ways plainly obvious, he only had the power afforded to him by his role. That suggests to me a kind of intransigence. And like when you talk about like sort of people in a mainstream media outlet, that they're a representative of a certain set of ideals, well, the same becomes true in the political establishment. Now we know that there are relationships between, obviously we've known for a long time, there are relationships between media and government that involves lobbying, commerce, shared interests. Now I know that when you talk about it from a sort of an anthropological perspective, you say, of course, we would all protect our positions in a hierarchy. And this returns me to the point, Jordan, where it requires of us as individuals a kind of personal awakening, like that perhaps the one has to undergo a kind of nekhiya, am I saying that right? The kind of journey into darkness that, you know, that you have recently experienced, and I'm sure most of us have our own version of, and to come out the other side of that with a conclusion not being how do I achieve more as an individual, but how do I convey love? How do I convey Christ consciousness? How do I...
Let's start with that then. So
I have to say, Russell Brand is one of the most impressive of the people who have argumented, let's say, or debated with Jordan Peterson. And I like him and respect him. I happen to share many of his views. And the view that humanity is malevolent burns within him very deeply. Whereas Jordan, and perhaps Jordan is a different kind of path. It's not that Jordan feels that malevolence doesn't exist, but he defends that humanity is weak and humanity is fallible. And Russell is saying more or less, yes, we can agree on that point, but I don't forgive them for that, and neither should you. And people should be attributed to these atrocities that they're committing, and so on. But see, I favor his viewpoint, but that's inconsequential. What they're trying to figure out is how to put an end to it. And in this circumstance, it would be to delegitimize all of those big media corporations by stop giving them attention that they don't deserve, nor have they earned. They might have earned it 60 or 40 years ago. They might have earned it. They might have been worthy of the trust that was placed in them. But I'd say in the last 20 years, they have strayed so far away from the purpose of it that their existence and their fall should be close, should be completely... They should be accountable for what they've done, for the amount of damage that they've done, for the ignorance that they have so obviously committed. And they should not be forgiven fundamentally for any of the crimes that they have committed. Because the greatest crime they've committed, in my opinion, is the censorship of truth. And that was a willful censorship of the truth. And when I looked at somebody like Kathy Newman, for me, it's a paradox, because on the one hand, Jordan went through that terrible process that he's telling that he's telling Russell right now, and he understands it, and he doesn't defend it, but he tries to illuminate Russell Brand about the actual process in which it occurs. And Russell would more or less defend him for standing up against it and defending the truth. But it's far more complicated than what it seems, or it's simple if you explain it like that. But just imagine that you were in that position, and if you did speak as an individual, then you would most definitely be fired. And I mean, I've seen it happen many times with different news anchors. They were quietly dismissed, and different, more how would you say it? More people who were more willing to compromise themselves for what the company was requesting took their place. I see it in radio broadcasts, for example, in our city, and somebody who I thought was somewhat neutral. She claimed to be very neutral, but I would say she was somewhat neutral. She was dismissed from her chair, and a radical leftist took her place. So they're both correct. That's the point. And the conversation is more like I don't know, it's very stimulating to watch, because when you see them, they're pointing two perspectives or more that are true. And it's not that they're having a debate, but more or less trying to persuade each other which one is the supreme ideal that they should be governed by, or that they should be accepting. And well, I saw what Kathy Newman did to Jordan Peterson, and I saw how he responded, and that particular video made him very, very famous, I would have to say, because the public outcry was just immense against her, and public favor for him went sky high, because that famous line that he said, in order to think, we need to risk being offensive. And then look at the conversation we're having right now. I mean, it's it was so brilliant to point that out in that moment. But Jordan Peterson has been doing that for years. So he, as a clinical psychologist, he always confesses that he likes to point out what's happening in the moment, and that's how he deals with his clients. So he sat back and started using his clinical psychologist to analyze what she was saying very, very carefully, and he responded accordingly. So, but this is the reason why corrupt media. See, it's much deeper than that, because you see, if there was no audience for it, then they wouldn't exist in the first place. But they exist, so there must be people out there that still consider them legitimate media. For me, I hope that most people in my generation will move on. I don't even watch news in my house. I watch media that I've carefully chosen and selected for their ability to be neutral and unbiased and report the truth as closely as they can. And that puts them at, typically that puts them at great risk, personally, financially. They can be killed, they can be arrested, they can be jailed. Like, I know what real press looks like. They're brave soldiers on the ground, and they put themselves in bodily harm to expose the truth. That's what a real journalist does. And they're nothing more than shine the light on something that somebody is trying to hide. And the public has always loved the undisputed truth laid bare, so to speak. And mainstream media has become so far removed from it that it's a parody. It's a parody act. It reminds me of like V from Vendetta, where that selfish clown of the Voice of London, if you've seen that movie, you know it, and he like watches himself speak on air narcissistically, and then he's shortly after that assassinated by V in his flat while he's in the shower. And it's the perfect irony, because he's supposed to be this big guy who's so powerful and whatnot, but at his last moment he was a coward, and everybody knew the truth about him, even though he was, supposed to be some big persona or whatever. And well, I suppose that's what happens to big media when they become so corrupted and they basically implode, I guess. So, but I thought I'd bring this conversation to your attention because it's quite important. I mean, every conversation that Jordan Peterson has with somebody, I like to listen, because there's always new data to observe and to absorb. So, thank you.